2.12 Architecture Capability. Now that we have already explored architecture structure, content, repositories, and governance, the next logical step is to understand what allows all of that to work consistently in a real enterprise. And that brings us to a very important Togaf concept, which is architecture capability. Welcome to J.K. Michael's Knowledge Series. Architecture capability is the enterprise's ability to do architecture work properly and continuously. In simple terms, it means the organization must have the right structures, roles, responsibilities, skills, and processes to create, use, maintain, and govern enterprise architecture. So architecture capability is not the architecture itself. It is the organizational ability to run architecture as a real business function. That opening distinction is extremely important both for practice and for the exam. If you are asked what architecture capability is, the right answer is not architecture diagrams, and it is not just target state models. The stronger answer is that it is the enterprise's ability to develop, use, sustain, and govern architecture continuously. In other words, capability is about making architecture operational. Now let's go deeper into what that really means. The section defines enterprise architecture capability as the ability to develop the architecture, use the architecture, sustain the architecture, and use the architecture to govern change. This is a very important distinction. Many learners think architecture is just diagrams, models, or target state designs. Togaf says that is not enough. The enterprise also needs the capability to operate architecture as an ongoing discipline. So architecture capability is really about turning architecture from something the enterprise produces once into something the enterprise can repeatedly rely on. And that point matters more than it may first appear. A company may build a target state architecture once, but unless it keeps using that architecture in projects, decisions, reviews, and change governance, the capability is still weak. So one of the first questions you should always ask is this: does the organization merely have architecture outputs, or does it truly have the ability to keep architecture active and relevant over time? Now the next question becomes, why is architecture capability needed in the first place? The section says that to carry out architectural activity effectively, the enterprise must put in place an appropriate business capability for architecture. That means architecture work needs organizational support, not just technical expertise. Without that support, architecture may be inconsistent, governance may be weak, stakeholders may ignore it, and architecture may not influence real change. In practice, architecture breaks down less often because nobody can draw models, and more often because nobody has built the structures, authority, processes, and management disciplines that make those models matter. So when architecture looks strong on slides but weak in delivery, that is usually not just a design problem, it is a capability problem. Now that the need for capability is clear, we can move into the first operating foundation, which is organization structure. Architecture capability requires appropriate organization structures. That means the enterprise needs a defined structural setup for architecture, such as architecture teams, reporting lines, governance boards, review bodies, and decision authorities. In practical terms, the organization must know where architecture sits and how it interacts with business and delivery functions. Architecture cannot float around informally if it is expected to shape enterprise decisions. Closely connected to that are roles and responsibilities. The section emphasizes roles and responsibilities because architecture work must not be vague. The enterprise must define who leads architecture, who approves decisions, who develops models, who maintains standards, who governs exceptions, and who engages stakeholders. And the practical meaning is very direct. If nobody clearly owns architecture decisions, architecture becomes advisory noise instead of a decision-making force. That is a point worth pausing on. The difference between architecture influence and architecture noise is often the difference between vague and explicit ownership. A company may have architects and standards, but unless decision authorities and governance bodies are clear, exceptions multiply, accountability weakens, and architecture loses force. So when you think about architecture capability, think not only about content, but also about placement, authority, and clarity of ownership. Now, underneath that structure, the enterprise also needs the right skills. Architecture capability depends on skills, and those skills go beyond technical knowledge. They include business understanding, modeling ability, governance knowledge, communication skill, stakeholder management, change thinking, and strategic judgment. A mature architecture capability needs capable people who can connect business strategy with architectural design and governance. That means architecture maturity is not only about technical depth, it is also about strategic thinking, influence, and enterprise judgment. And those skilled people still need processes. Architecture capability includes processes for architecture development, governance, review and approval, standards management, repository management, stakeholder engagement, and ongoing maintenance. The practical meaning is straightforward. Architecture must be repeatable and manageable. That only happens when there are defined ways of working. So good architects alone do not eliminate the need for process. In fact, the stronger the enterprise becomes, the more it needs disciplined, repeatable architecture processes that can scale across teams and initiatives. Now, this leads us to one of the most important ideas in the whole section. Architecture capability is not only about producing architecture, it is also about using architecture to govern change. That is one of the strongest messages from Togaf. Architecture is valuable when it shapes real decisions, investments, projects, solution design, standards compliance, and transformation priorities. So a strong architecture capability ensures that architecture is actually used in enterprise change. If architecture is created but never used to guide project choices, investment decisions, or standards compliance, then its practical value is extremely limited. This is where architecture either becomes a business force or remains just a presentation artifact. The test of capability is not whether architecture exists on paper. The test is whether architecture influences the way change happens in the enterprise. So when you think about capability, think beyond production. Think about use, decision-making, and governance influence. Now the section goes even further, and this is another very practical insight. It says that except in cases where architecture capabilities are set up only to support a single change program, a successful enterprise architecture practice must sit on a firm operational footing. That means architecture should not be treated as a temporary side activity. It should operate like a stable business function. In practical terms, it needs management, funding, operating discipline, measurable performance, and sustained organizational presence. So architecture is not supposed to be a one-time project office that appears for a transformation and then fades away. It is supposed to become part of how the enterprise operates. And that takes us directly to another key point. The architecture practice should be treated like a business. Togaf says an enterprise architecture practice should be run like any other operational unit in a business. That means the architecture function should think about value delivery, performance, service quality, risks, resources, stakeholder satisfaction, supplier relationships, and operational environment. This is much broader than merely running the ADM. That line is especially important because many learners assume the ADM is the whole answer. It is not. ADM matters, but architecture capability goes much wider than ADM execution. From an exam perspective, that point is very testable. A likely distractor is any answer that makes architecture capability sound like just running the ADM well. The better answer is that a mature architecture practice should be run like an operational unit or business function, with management disciplines around it. Now let's move into those operational support areas, because this is where Togaf becomes extremely practical. The section lists the key capabilities the enterprise architecture practice should establish beyond the core ADM processes. The first is financial management. This means managing the funding and financial control of the architecture function. Practically, that includes budgeting for architecture tools and staff, managing architecture-related costs, and demonstrating value for money. So architecture capability must be funded and financially managed just like any other important enterprise function. The second is performance management. This means measuring how well the architecture capability is performing. Practically, that includes tracking architecture effectiveness, measuring adoption of standards, assessing delivery quality, and monitoring outcomes and value. So architecture must be measurable. It cannot rely only on assumed value. The third is service management. This means treating architecture as a service provided to the enterprise. Practically, that includes architecture support for projects, advisory services, review services, design support, and stakeholder-facing architecture services. This is an important mindset shift because it reminds us that architecture is not only a control function, it is also a service function. The fourth is risk and opportunity management. This means identifying both threats and beneficial opportunities related to architecture work. Practically, that includes the risk of inconsistent standards, the risk of architecture irrelevance, the opportunity for reuse, and the opportunity for cost savings or faster transformation. So capability is not just defensive, it is also meant to help the enterprise see where architecture can create advantage. Now let's build on that with the second group of support areas. The fifth is resource management. This means managing the people, time, tools, and capacity needed for architecture. Practically, it includes staffing architecture teams, balancing workload, managing capability gaps, and allocating architecture effort across initiatives. So architecture capability must think actively about capacity and allocation. The sixth is communications and stakeholder management. This means engaging stakeholders effectively and managing communication around architecture. Practically, it includes explaining architecture value, influencing executives, handling resistance, keeping delivery teams aligned, and ensuring stakeholders understand decisions and standards. This is a very important area, and it is one of the common things learners forget. Communication and stakeholder management are not optional extras. They are part of architecture capability. The seventh is supplier management. This means managing external suppliers who influence or support architecture capability. Practically, that includes architecture tool vendors, consulting partners, technology suppliers, and external services that affect standards and solution design. This matters because enterprise architecture often depends on external platforms, tools, and advice. The eighth is configuration management. This means controlling architecture assets, versions, and changes in a disciplined way. Practically, that includes version control of architecture artifacts, change tracking, consistency of repository content, and maintaining reliable architecture baselines. This is what keeps architecture assets trustworthy over time. And the ninth is environment management. This means managing the operating environment in which the architecture capability functions. Practically, that includes tool environment, repository environment, working conditions for the architecture team, and operational conditions supporting architecture work. So capability also depends on the environment that supports the team's actual work. Now, if you step back and look at those 9 areas together, you can see why Togaf says architecture capability should be treated like a business. These are not just modeling activities, they are management disciplines. And from an exam perspective, that is another important signal. A likely distractor is an answer that reduces capability to only people and process, but Togaf clearly includes financial, service, stakeholder, supplier, configuration, and environment dimensions as well. Now let's move from concepts into the actual operating sequence of how architecture capability works in practice. First, the enterprise establishes the architecture function. That means it creates a defined architecture capability with a mandate, structure, and governance model. Second, it defines roles, responsibilities, and skills. The organization assigns architecture leadership, defines decision rights, and ensures the right people and skills are in place. Third, it sets up architecture processes. Processes are defined for architecture development, governance, standards, repository management, stakeholder engagement, and change control. Fourth, it puts supporting operational capabilities in place. That means the architecture practice is supported through financial, performance, service, risk, resource, communications, supplier, configuration, and environment management. Fifth, it develops and maintains architecture outputs. The capability produces architecture content and keeps it current over time. Sixth, it uses architecture to govern change. Architecture is applied to projects, investments, solution decisions, and transformation governance. And seventh, it measures and improves the capability. The enterprise monitors how effective the architecture function is and improves it as needed. So the logic in one sentence is this: architecture capability works by turning enterprise architecture from a set of documents into a managed organizational function that can continuously guide and govern change. That is the strongest one-line memory anchor for the whole topic. Now let's make the topic more visual and easier to revise. The first table in the section explains the core meaning of architecture capability. It shows four major elements: develop architecture, which means creating architecture descriptions, models, and guidance, and this matters because it provides architectural direction. Use architecture, which means applying architecture in decisions and delivery, and this matters because it makes architecture relevant. Sustain architecture, which means maintaining architecture over time, and this matters because it keeps architecture useful as the enterprise changes. And govern change with architecture, which means using architecture to guide and control transformation, and this matters because it connects architecture to real business change. That table is one of the strongest revision anchors in the section because it compresses the whole meaning of architecture capability into four memorable actions. The second table explains the operational areas of architecture capability. It sets out the 9 capability areas, what each one covers, and a practical example of each. Financial management covers funding and cost control. Performance management covers measuring effectiveness. Service management treats architecture as an enterprise service. Risk and opportunity management manages threats and opportunities. Resource management manages people and capacity. Communications and stakeholder management engages and influences stakeholders. Supplier management manages external vendors and partners. Configuration management controls versions and changes, and environment management maintains the operating environment. That table is valuable because it shows that architecture capability is supported by management disciplines, not just architecture methods. Now, let's look at the conceptual explanation of Figure 5, because that helps pull the whole section together visually. The diagram shows architecture capability at the top. Underneath it, you have one foundational group: organization structures, roles and responsibilities, skills, and processes. And then you have the operational support areas: financial management, performance management, service management, risk and opportunity management, resource management, communications and stakeholder management, supplier management, configuration management, and environment management. What that diagram is telling us is that architecture capability is not created just by naming architects. It is built by combining organizational foundations with operational management disciplines. The first group provides the basic operating foundation: structure, roles, skills, and processes. The second group provides the business management disciplines needed to keep the architecture practice sustainable and effective. Now let's ground all of that in the practical example from the section. Imagine a large insurance company starts an enterprise architecture practice. At first, it only has one chief architect and a few diagrams. Projects do whatever they want, standards are inconsistently applied, and architecture reviews happen late. That is a very realistic starting point for many organizations. To build real architecture capability, the company defines an architecture governance structure, assigns roles and responsibilities, hires and develops architects with business and technical skills, creates review and repository processes, budgets for architecture tools and staff, defines service offerings for projects, sets KPIs for architecture turnaround and compliance, creates communication plans for stakeholders, tracks architecture risks and opportunities, and manages standards, suppliers, and versions of architecture content. Now, architecture becomes a real operational function. It can shape transformation, support programs, govern solutions, and sustain enterprise standards over time.
And that is exactly the difference between having architects and having architecture capability. That example is one of the strongest practical illustrations in the section.